hot button land use training. I also want to thank Jefferson Community College for hosting us. My name is Samuel Wilson. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the new assistant planner for Jefferson County. Been with the county for about 9 months now. And I just want to let you know that we will be sending out certificates through email to each and every one of you for this training. Before we get started, I would just like to introduce our two speakers. We have Patricia Burke and then Paula Gilbert from the New York State Department of State. So I'm just going to pass it on.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Trish Burke, and I'm co-presenting with Paula Gilbert. You probably have seen us presenting before at different shows, but it's Paula's first time here at Jefferson County Community College, but not mine. Is there anyone here in the audience who's relatively new to their ZBA or planning board? Yeah? Okay.
How many years or how much time?
Within this year.
Wow. All right. Very new. What about you?
1 month.
Oh, it's really brand new. Welcome. And did I see somebody else?
No, how many years?
How long?
18 months.
Okay, great. And
15 years.
Okay, well, I think you get the award for being the newbie. We had the Guide to Planning and Zoning with us, the publication. We recommend that new board members get it. It's not necessary for you veterans who probably know it chapter and verse by now, if you've been coming to your trainings. But this is an important training, I think, because it has to do with controversial land use applications. And it seems like every municipality in New York State these days has at least one hot button, we call them hot button land uses. This course used to be called LULUs. That's an acronym for L-U-L-U, Locally Unwanted Land Uses. So we got a lot of flack from that because in the land use game, there are winners and there are losers. There are people that stand to gain economically and there are people that lose economically. So that's why we decided not to call it unwanted land uses. We're just going to go with hot button because whether you're for them or against them, they do push buttons and get communities going. And at the Department of State, we're not a regulatory agency, so we don't tell you to do something a certain way. We're only here to tell you what the law is, and you can take it from there. After all, it's your community, and you can decide for yourself, for the most part, which land uses you want in your communities and which that you don't want. There are some land uses in New York State that you don't have a say in. The state occupies the field. Some land uses are controlled by the United States Constitution, another by New York's rules and regulations such as adult uses, First Amendment rights, the siting of certain renewable energy facilities. What else? Marijuana, that's the siting of cannabis, I should say. So we're going to touch on those. And at the Department of State, we are professional planners and we have attorneys. So our services are free. If you have questions, you can email us or call us. We take questions all the time. That's our bread and butter. You can also avail yourselves of our legal services as well. Those are free if you have questions, and I think I've covered just about everything. So let's get started here. Does everyone in the audience have zoning? Okay, that's good. We don't have any communities without zoning because it's really hard to regulate land use if you don't have zoning in your community. So if I could change the...
no, that's this one.
Which...
That one.
All right, we did have a lesson. We did have a lesson before we started. I guess I wasn't paying attention well
Yeah,
enough.
the top one is the where.
Okay.
Button, right.
All right, so community opposition. Generally, community opposition when you have a controversial land use is not enough to stop the application. If the use is already permitted by your local regulations and permitted by your zoning, and the applicant is fulfilling all of those applications, then it's really hard to say no to that use. So it's generally not a valid basis for denying an application. So we call these people the vocal majority, or in some cases the vocal minority. They could just be really loud when they show up to picket and to demonstrate. Does anybody want to share? Do you have an example of community opposition? Anybody calling your house or picketing out in front, or taking you off the Christmas card list, or anything like that?
Any of you have to be escorted to your car by a police officer? Because that's happened.
That has happened. Yeah, I do know. Not in this county, but a different county, not so far from here. Okay, so next slide. Moratorium. We are going to go into this a little more depth because I think it's very important. A moratorium is a stopgap measure. It's not saying no to the use, and it's not saying we're never going to have this use in particular, but it's a stopgap measure that allows the community to say, hold on, we have this controversial issue at our door, the wolf is at our door, banging on the door, and before we make a hasty decision, we really should take some time and study this issue and perhaps change our laws and maybe our permits or anything else like that. So the moratorium, you can adopt a moratorium law to update your comprehensive plan. So updating your comprehensive plan is really number one in the land use game. Even if you're updating your zoning, your definitions, or anything like that, that comes after you update your comprehensive plan. Your comp plan is really number one. Update that, identify your goals, and whatever goals and mission and vision you have, then you would update your zoning definitions and your zoning to drive the goals that you've identified in your comprehensive plan. So that could take time. So it's a good idea to adopt a moratorium while you're updating your comp plan or any other laws so that you can really study the issue and not make a hasty decision. That way you can have regulations that will avoid having unplanned and inefficient growth, and you won't have any projects or construction that's inconsistent with your comprehensive plan. Because remember, when you are reviewing applications, you should be reviewing them in light of the goals of your comp plan. Whatever people before you have adopted and said, this is what we want for our community. It's not necessarily what you want yourselves as a board, or you think a project is good or bad. If it's in harmony with the goals of your comprehensive plan, that's good. And if it's not, maybe it's not the best plan for your community, or you're going to have to impose some conditions to mitigate or to offset anything that's not in harmony with the comp plan. So making the right conditions can make the difference between this being a good project and a lousy project for your community. We do have a publication on the adoption of the moratorium. And by the way, moratorium comes from the Latin root word M-O-R-A, which means to slow down. It doesn't mean to stop. So to be successful or to be lawful, your moratorium law has to have these 5 key elements. You have, number one, it's got to be a reasonable time frame relative to the action being addressed. So what's a reasonable time frame? The courts have found that 3 to 6 months is enough time, reasonably, for the board to do some research and to make some decisions and to come to a conclusion. Does that seem reasonable, or does that seem too short? Well, it depends on the project, right? In the case of a wind project, maybe you would have to study wind speeds during all 4 seasons. So you might be able to justify asking for an extension. We need more time because we only got wind speeds in the spring and summer, and we need the fall and winter. So the courts might look favorably on that and say, okay, fair enough. But if you are a community that just keeps renewing the moratorium, renewing, extending, the courts will not smile favorably on that and will probably side on the side of the applicant. It has to be for a valid public purpose. So for example, we have emergency situations where you could adopt a moratorium. Maybe you've got some sewer lines that break or some water mains that break. So you might want to adopt a moratorium in an emergency situation saying, no more permits until we get this situation fixed. That makes sense because people's health is impacted by that. The third element is you need to address a situation where the burden imposed is shared substantially by the public at large. So pretty much everyone in the municipality or large geographical section of the municipality is going to be burdened, if you will, by this moratorium temporarily. The fourth one is strict adherence to the statutory adoption procedures. A moratorium is a local law and it's got to follow the strict procedures to the letter of the law. If you screw up and you don't dot the I's and cross the T's, you get one little thing wrong, it could invalidate your law, so you don't want to do that. And finally, certain expiration time. That's not a typo. It's certain expiration time. So your moratorium should clearly state this is for 90 days, this is for 120 days. You name it, but it's got to identify a very specific time period for it to be a valid moratorium law. So you're going to adopt it in the form of a local law, and if you have an existing zoning ordinance or an existing local law, treat this as an amendment to that ordinance or to that local law in your definitions. And clearly define the activity being affected. For example, is this affecting permits or is this affecting the construction itself? And if the moratorium supersedes any provision of town or village law, then it has to be adopted by municipal home rule law. And you also have to specifically cite that you are superseding state law to adopt this moratorium. And here's a little more information. Also clearly state and establish a valid public purpose for the moratorium. And be sure to state the moratorium is in effect for that specific time period. We've already gone over that. And include a relief mechanism. Just like zoning, if you have zoning, you have to have a relief mechanism because there are some times when the moratorium won't be a perfect fit for every single landowner or application, and they may be entitled to relief from the moratorium. Because this is considered a form of a local law, you're going to have two referral processes that you need to consider. The first being seeker and the second being county referral 239M. So if the moratorium is amending your existing zoning, you have to refer this to the county for their recommendation before you can move forward with any decision on your part. So under seeker, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, moratoria are automatically classified as type 2 actions. And I like to remember, type 2, no further review. That's good for boards. That's a quick and dirty way out of this. Just because you've asked if seeker, you've considered seeker, and seeker doesn't apply to the type 2 action moratoria, you still need to include that in your meeting minutes or in your notes, your application notes. So if you're ever challenged in the future, it will be very important that you didn't overlook this step, that you considered seeker, it didn't apply, and now you can continue on with your review. And that's about it for that file, that slide. So
I would say it's important though, because that's a legislative action, so it's your town board or village board that's doing it, and they tend to forget seeker. So being that you all see land use applications that come before you, sometimes it's helpful to like remind your town boards and governing boards that, you know, sometimes when they're going about adopting a comprehensive plan, updating your zoning, doing a moratorium because you're considering the fact of updating your zoning or whatever's going on in your community, that they also are required to consider seeker as well.
Good reminder. Thank you. Okay, so here are some possible approvals that will be or might be affected by a moratorium. So it could be any new land use application, or it could apply to projects that are already in the pipeline. It can apply to permits and the establishment of certain businesses, especially adult uses, junkyards, mining. These are all controversial issues in and of themselves. And it also can affect the approval of citing certain uses like a solid waste facility or a landfill. That's what we should just call it, a landfill, instead of a solid waste facility. So what about vested rights? What happens to people that have already applied for their permit or they've already started their project? Because this probably has happened in your community. You have a controversial land use, or the word is getting out that, you know, a developer wants to come in, and it's possible that the town doesn't want this use, and they're going to say, adopt a law saying we don't want this use. Do you think there's going to be a mad rush at the door for people to get their foot in and get their permits and get those jobs started before you can adopt local laws saying, no, we don't want? Of course that's going to happen. That's very likely, and, you know, a foxy developer is going to do this. But a moratorium does apply under certain circumstances to permits and applications already in the pipeline. It has to do with whether or not the developer, the landowner, has achieved vested rights. So vested right is the right to build or to use property according to the law as it existed before you've adopted your moratorium. If the landowner has undertaken substantial construction and made substantial expenditures. So those words, if and construction, are underlined because they really make a difference when determining if a landowner has obtained vested rights or not. So we have vested rights, a substantial construction, and a substantial expenditures test. So do you think it's merely somebody putting up some flimsy signage and just running some red tape or running a little fence around the property? Is that deemed vested rights? No? Yes or no? Who says yes? No. I mean, they may have started the construction, but if they haven't made substantial investments, then they don't have vested rights. So here's the test. Do they have the most basic and impermanent nature with rudimentary detailing and flimsy and inexpensive materials? So if they've cheaped out and they've just put some really cheap plastic deer fencing maybe, or some straw bales, and maybe some signage, they haven't really invested a lot into the construction. Those are temporary and flimsy construction materials, so the courts do not consider that having vested rights in the project. And obtaining vested rights essentially makes uses under construction legal non-conforming uses. And a little more on vested rights. So here we have two cases that demonstrated when and whether the developer had obtained vested rights. In Hasco Electric Corporation versus Dassler, the courts determined that moratorium may not be used to stop building operations begun under a valid building permit, which continued in good faith to the extent the property owner had secured vested rights. So there was a good faith effort. Nobody was trying to sneak in there and get their foot in the door, and they had begun building operations, so they had vested rights. In this last one, Temkin versus Karaguzoff, Valid building operations may not be stopped in anticipation of the moratorium to prevent a landowner from qualifying. City case, New York City failed to follow the proper procedure when enacting their stopgap zoning. So this one was overturned on procedural defects. Remember, I told you it's really important to follow the moratorium to the letter of the law, otherwise it could be challenged and it may not be found as valid. And sometimes, I mentioned, there are times when the moratoria are oppressive on developers and landowners, and they can seek relief under certain circumstances. So variance applications from the interim zoning ordinance have to meet the same statutory standards as though this interim zoning were permanent. So during a moratorium, it's common for the governing board, for example, your town board, to be doing the variance process rather than the ZBA. If so, when you're adopting your moratorium, you should clearly also identify which board will be the relief board for reviewing the moratoria variances.
Alrighty. So now we've gone through moratoria. So let's start with some of the hot button land uses that you're probably seeing in your own community. Who would say short-term rentals is an issue in your community? Okay, surprisingly, not that many hands. If you were in the Adirondacks, everybody would like stand up and be like, yes, here, definitely. So it depends. It kind of skews in a lot of our communities, the real estate market. So, I think a lot of municipalities are still struggling with how to deal with this. So short-term rentals in New York State law is silent on what short-term rentals are. So there's no definition, there's no real rules around them. It really tosses back to the municipalities using their home rule to define, prohibit, and regulate short-term rentals as they choose. So some municipalities have decided to outright ban them. Some have decided that there's time restrictions on them. There's like Cooperstown where they don't allow them in the village at all except for induction weekends, since there's not enough hotel rooms for people to come up for that weekend, so they allow people to rent them out at that point. But every community has to see this kind of differently because the pressure on your real estate market is going to be different compared to in some communities over others. Like Placid, there's, I think, across them in the town of North Elba, I think there's 700 properties that are short-term rentals. So for them, it's a severe issue because their police officers used to have to live inside the municipality that they serve, but they can't afford to do that. So, and I think we're seeing that in a lot of our more touristy communities. We see it a lot in the Finger Lakes regions as well, and then downstate. So pretty much kind of everywhere. So again, up to you to kind of figure out how you want to go about regulating this use, or if you want to regulate them or not. So of course, with all uses, there's pros and cons. So some of the benefits is it can be an influx of tourism spending in your communities, especially if you don't have a lot of traditional bed and breakfast, or maybe you don't have that many hotels. So it does kind of open the door for people to experience your community in a different way. There's potential for revenue. If you ask anybody at Airbnb, they're going to tell you that people come and they spend more money in your communities. They're going to your restaurants, they're shopping on your main streets. So that can be sometimes really helpful. Potential improvement of blighted properties. Depending on how many there are in your community, I think if you're in the Adirondacks, you'll just see properties move really fast. That's not necessarily the case everywhere else. In incentivize some of your future development or opportunities for commerce. So if you are a really popular area, it's really beautiful up here, so it opens up the doors to not just people shopping on your main street, but like maybe services, as you'll see, like kayaking and whitewater rafting and fishing tours and things like that, that brings people to enjoy your recreational amenities. And it could extend the vibrancy of existing popular areas into neighboring places. So like I said, with Lake Placid, we see it kind of trickle over to the rest of Saranac Lake and North Elba and other places, because it's harder to find places to, sort of stay. And I think it sometimes gives people more of an authentic local feel of what your community is like, which people sometimes really like. But at the same time, I think everybody has seen like a nightmare story of a short-term rental. So I'm not sure the popularity over time, especially because people have been, they charge like a lot of funding now for like cleaning and things. I think it's kind of almost geared people back into hotels. So it'll be interesting to see over time if it's a trend that continues or if it's a trend that starts to kind of subside. So some of the challenges, of course, hotels and bed and breakfast don't necessarily like to have them in their community because it's taking away its competition from their own places. And they're not necessarily taxed or inspected like hotels and other major places and bed and breakfasts. And so they might not necessarily be up to code depending on how you go about your registration of these or if you require any kind of inspections. And of course, anytime the location, you're kind of biting into their bottom lines. And then for local governments, of course, it's difficult because a lot of times these can bring a lot of nuisance with them. So where do these people park? Are they parking all over the front lawn because they're bringing a ton of people with them? Are they making a ton of noise so you can't, hear them anywhere, or like they're interrupting the, kind of the peace of your neighborhood? They're having like major parties every weekend. We've seen that. Our other short-term rental course actually has a picture of like this house party with like people like drinking on the roof, like having a grand old time. So that sometimes happens in some communities as well, and you might not necessarily want to live next door to the party house. They also can sometimes put out their like garbage collection on a different day that's normal because they're there, they leave on a Monday and your garbage collection is on Wednesday and they're gonna put it out there. So that can be, kind of annoying for the neighbors. It can also lead to the loss of long-term rentals, which sometimes is actually really difficult because in a lot of touristy places, you're kind of relying on service industry jobs, and if those people can't find places to live, it's kind of hard to find for business owners to find people to work because they have to travel further and further away. So it kind of starts a vicious circle. It can fuel real estate speculation, so loss of affordable home ownership opportunities. I think if you ask anybody who lives in most of the park, they would say that is probably their number one problem. And the loss of neighborhood character from displacement. So people are coming and going every weekend. You don't know what to expect. It's not your just usual neighbors that you get to know in your own communities. And an absence of a statewide tax or safety framework. So a lot of times the issue here is they're operating a commercial business in a residential zone. So sometimes just the use of them can conflict with what's going on with your neighbors. So if you think of it as a commercial use and they're being assessed as residential, it's kind of unfair to other business users. And I think only about 26 of the counties have a county tax-wide agreement with Airbnb and VRBO. So a lot of times you're losing out on any of the money that comes in from there. So some of the, how do you go about, defining this use? Because a lot of times we're also kind of, with government tends to be reactionary. not proactive. So it's difficult when these kind of show up in your community and you don't really know how many actually really exist out there and how much of a problem it really is. So using some precise definitions in your community can be really helpful. So that's things like occupants can't stay for more than 30 days is typically what we see in most places. There could be a permanent provision for how many bedrooms are in there, if they have a kitchen, how much of a kitchen, and how you deal with sanitation issues. And then the owner isn't necessarily on site, so I think that's the sell point of VRBO or VRBO, is the owner's never there, but Airbnb tends to do more hosted stays. And on that point, we have the host, so the person who offers the unit or the bedroom for rent. Hosted means that the host is on site, so maybe they have like an in-law apartment that they short-term rental, so they live on the other side of the house. The people who stay in live on the other side. My parents live in a really touristy place in the state of Maine now. Their neighbor has an Airbnb that he often rents out to traveling nurses because they stick around for usually a short period of time, maybe a couple months at most, before they move on to their next assignment. So, and he likes them because they're not usually around that much. They're kind of quiet because they're working all the time. Then there's the unhosted, where the host doesn't live on site. And that can be sometimes difficult for communities because if there is a ruckus that happens at the site, it's sometimes hard to get in touch with somebody to go and actually show up at the site and tell people to kind of like calm down. And then primary versus non-primary residence. Is the rental property the host's main residence? It's difficult though to regulate based on where the owner lives. In fact, there was a federal court case out of New Orleans that they tried to kind of strike a deal and say, okay, we realize that this can help people who live here permanently year-round because they can make a little bit of money. It's an expensive city to live in. So we're gonna make it a little bit easier for people who are full-time residents versus the people who own these properties from out of town. And that ended up being challenged and invalidated. So it's really difficult to try to, because we've had this discussion with some communities that say, like, we realize it's expensive to live in New York. We don't want to necessarily preclude our residents from making a little bit of money occasionally, but is there a way that we can encourage this, the residents that live here all the time versus, people who clearly picked up these properties from, out of state or downstate, that aren't really here ever, they're just here to really rent these properties. And the difficulty there is we tend to shy away from that just because it's hard with land use regulations to really say, kind of make distinctions of the people who are visiting these properties. So, with that, the restrictions on definition. So, like I said, with Cooperstown, it's, just the weekend of induction weekend, or you could be a municipality that says, hey, we're gonna allow you to do it, but only 1 or 2 weekends a month. You can have a permitting system put in place. You can restrict it by your zoning districts, so, and you can definitely cap the number of rental nights. So some municipalities do it like you're allowed to do 12 out of the year and that's it. But of course with, land use regulations, with zoning regulations, it's always really difficult doing the enforcement side. So you can have really good, and we always recommend that everybody has good regulations, but sometimes if you don't have the enforcement piece in place, it's kind of hard to keep an eye on how many people are actually doing this, or are they doing it under the radar. The one thing that is missing from these slides is a website called airdna.co. And what's there is it's kind of there to encourage the it's takes a look at the financial side of the short-term rentals that exist in your community, but it also tells you who exists there. So from an enforcement mechanism, it gives you an idea of one, how many exist in your community, and then it can actually tell you some, like what they charge per night on average, so how much money they're making out of these things. So sometimes it can be helpful to turn to technology to kind of get a handle on what's happening there. So you might not know it exists, but maybe it does. So it kind of is a good place to start when looking at this issue. And then the operational restrictions, again, which really becomes an enforcement issue. So you can put maximum occupancy limits in place, like, you know, we only want people here for 5 days, maybe not 30 days. The rental period and frequency, so you can do it 2 or 3 times a month or once a month for 12 months. You can put operational restrictions on parking, how many spots are there. The noise issue, of course, a lot of municipalities have noise ordinances in place. Of course, we like to really call it sound, because sound can be recorded by decibels. Noise is kind of subjective to the person. One person's noise is another person's awesome band. It's kind of like everybody's interest in music. Some people like metal and some people don't. They might consider it noise. Emergency access, especially for if an emergency happens, you want to make sure that there's access to the parcel itself. A mandatory designated representative. We see a lot more of this in municipalities, so if they are having, a keg party and it's getting out of control, some municipalities actually have it down that a designated respondent or representative has to show up at the site within an hour. Of course, again, that means that your poor, probably code or zoning enforcement officer has to also show up to make sure that they do it, but sometimes you can kind of force them into compliance with just having it. And of course, you can fine for people for putting out, their trash and refuse at the wrong times. So that's the quick and dirty on short-term rentals. And Trish is going to talk next about some barn events.
Okay, thanks. I'm really surprised that short-term rentals aren't a hot topic up here in the North Country. Not even like the Thousand Islands, we're not too close,
It's hot down in the bay.
I was just with somebody trying to find an apartment. We were in the Woodstock area down in the Hudson Valley. It's all but impossible to find regular housing for the average Joe, because the landlords, people like Paul and I, we can make way more renting our apartment 2 or 3 nights out of the month than we could charge for rent for a normal person for the whole month. And it effectively has, taken that housing block out of your community, and we're already experiencing housing pressures, and it's just crazy. And COVID didn't do much to help the situation, especially in New York City. Everybody was like trying to escape the city, and they had lots of money to pay, I'll take a short-term rental, I'll take it for 2 years, and it changes the character of your community. So it is hard trying to find that balance between maybe somebody that wants to rent their camp out one weekend a summer versus now we're going to be doing this to balance our family checkbook and make it a source of regular income. So now we have barn events. I know we have barns up here. So this can be a controversial issue. Who's been to a barn event, a wedding, a party, anything? Yeah, these are like the thing now, right? To get married. Can you imagine 50 years ago getting married in a barn? That would be like the last thing that you'd want to do. And now it's so trendy. And whether or not people are doing this on the up and up with permits, health and safety inspections, and whether they're just getting together to throw a small family wedding in the barn, there can be big differences. If you are already dealing with this in your zoning, we recommend that you don't call these barn weddings. The word event, barn event, probably covers a lot more, because oftentimes maybe just the party or the reception is happening at the farm or the barn, not the actual wedding ceremony itself, so it might be easier to change your zoning definition to use the word barn events. So,
Sorry.
how do you know when farming operation? So we all know there's a lot of pressure on New York State farms and family farms, and they are doing everything they can to keep the money coming in during all 4 seasons. And this kind of event could really be the difference between a family farm staying open and having to sell the farm to convert it to residential subdivisions or any other use. Some operations are protected through New York State ag markets and some are not. And it happens to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So what activities are protected as part of a farm operation? It's a case-by-case basis. These promotional events, these barn events, may be protected if it's part of a farm operation where, number one, it directly relates to the sale or promotion of a beverage produced on the farm. That means, to fall into this category, at least 51% of the on-farm production is produced by the grains grown on the farm, the hops, the grapes, the fruit, the juice, etc. So 51% has to be created on the farm proper. These events have to be incidental and subordinate to the retail sale of beverages on site. And it has to be hosted by the farm or the farm customers. So it can't be that you're hiring an outside caterer to come in and do these events and bring their own wines or bring their own kegs of beer or what have it. So they can't be outside parties, and they have to be unrelated parties. And finally, they have to feature a beverage produced at the farm. So if this beverage isn't made at the farm proper, then it's not going to enjoy any protection under New York State ag and markets.
Question,
Sure.
milk is produced on a farm, what if they're just selling milk, plus they have an alcoholic beverage area too?
Well, the beverage, that additional beverage, is it fermented milk? I don't know what fermented.
Never know.
Yeah, it's got to be 51% of what's produced. 51, at least 51% of what's produced on that farm, in order for it to qualify for ag and markets protection. Remember, ag and markets is coming in saying, yes, we want this farm to remain a viable operation, but at some point, Joe Farmer is making more money doing a couple of banquets 3 times a month than he is with his dairy production. And they're trying to find that balance, and that's why they apply that 4-prong test. Yeah, so here's
Have a milk party.
a milk. Yeah, I think there's a place in Richmond Springs or Richfield Springs. It was called the Dairy Bar, right? No, like Dairy Bar. What did they serve at a dairy bar?
Chocolate milk.
Yeah, but it was it was like from the 40s and the 50s, and that's what it was called, a dairy bar. But it was like ice cream and stuff like that. But yeah, no alcohol.
I used to stop there.
You know the one? Is it Quack? Is it like Quack's Dairy Bar?
No, Wax is,
I think it's still there.
Wax is still outside of Madison, New York. It's on Route 20.
Yes, Route 20.
The dairy
Yeah.
bars, it was in Richfield Springs, it may still be there. I used to commute back and forth to Albany. I lived farther south at that time, so I took Route 20 and I always stopped at the dairy bar.
Okay, so I didn't
This
imagine
man
it.
knows.
It's back in my memory.
Well, it's way before you're born.
No, but I really remember going by there. Like
Is that right?
it's in here. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to talk about farm wineries, distilleries, and state ag districts. So New York State agricultural districts are different than regular agricultural zones. You can have regular ag zoning in your community, and then you can have something known as a New York State Agricultural District. These places have very strong farming protections because they recognize that farming is the #1 event that happens there, and they don't want it diluted with other activities, and they want to support the farmers and the farming way of life. So, although the State Liquor Authority, they do the ABC laws, the State Liquor Authority license may allow the sale of alcoholic beverages not made from crops grown on the farm. They are not part of the farm operation. So that's your question. They have milk, and now they're having some beer afterwards that they ship in. So the production and sale is not necessarily protected under the ag markets because it's not that it doesn't trigger that 51% produced on the farm. So they don't enjoy those kinds of protections. So the state alcohol beverage control laws, those are the ABC laws, those are a little different, and the ABC regulates and controls the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages within the state. So those ABC laws, they define a farm cidery, a farm distillery, a farm winery, and a farm brewery. These are very specific definitions. You can recreate them in your own zoning, but they are very specific for a purpose for the ABC laws.
Do you guys have a lot of those up here? We do down by us in Albany. I feel like some of these places become more of a amusement thing in like the the Saturdays of fall where they have food trucks and liquor and cider and all these crazy things. It's kind of ramped way up since COVID.
Yeah, so I tell the story. I went to a friend's birthday party in a barn that looked just like this, and it was a private barn, and they didn't have permits, they didn't have anything, and it was very idyllic, just like this, with the lighting and everything, but the place was filled with hay bales and candles for ambiance all over the place, and it was beautiful, but there was a band, and there was drinking and dancing, but I keep thinking, the reason we have permits is to keep people safe. I mean, we've got candles and hay bales here, and everyone was responsible, nothing happened, it was a great time, but I just think how easily that could have gone wrong, How easily maybe those barn doors didn't open for people to try to get out in a hurry, maybe they were stuck or rusty or whatever, or maybe, the fresh water was impacted and it wasn't safe to drink and people got sick. We have laws and permits for a reason, and it's not to be onerous and to make life, more hassle and bureaucracy. It's to keep people safe, and this is a perfect example of that. So, I digress, but a barn...
Were they from the city? It's the real question, because that sounds like a real city slicker thing.
They were not from the city, but here's the thing. It was I think that was like their trial run. That was their foot in the door to see, we can do this. See how easy it was, and see, I think they're just going to build on that. We'll do it next time just for friends, but that's how these things start out. You do it for a family or a friend, and it's okay, and then you push the envelope. You invite more people, and it gets bigger, and you learn what you did wrong and what you did right, and still without permits until.
Hopefully they went to LED candles instead.
I don't know. Let's hope. Let's hope. But if you are not in one of these state-designated agricultural districts, or the barn rental revenue exceeds that of what is produced on the farm as the farming operation, then here's what you can restrict at the local level. This pertains to you guys. This is what you can regulate if you want to, if you have the right local laws. You can regulate the hours of operation. So we always caution boards, oh, hold up, if you're regulating the hours of operation, you are fooling around with the internal operation of a business. That is very dangerous territory. Contact the Department of State and we can guide you through that. We also have an opinion of counsel that is very helpful that can guide you. But given this circumstance, you can regulate the hours of operation because you're already in a rural community probably, so you're not, maybe the community is not used to, loud bands at, 11 or 12 o'clock at night. You can regulate the number of events per month. Maybe you say 1 event per month or 6 events per season. It's up to you, but know that you do have the right to regulate this because it's not the primary function of that farm. They're under farming zoning, even if they're not in a state ag district, and it's not the allowable use for which it was originally intended. And you can prohibit regular rentals of the farm buildings for weddings. We should say for events, right? Because it's not necessarily a wedding. So you do have a friend in the Department of Ag and Markets, and the Department of Ag and Markets evaluates if your local restrictions are unreasonably restrictive in terms of limits on the number and the size of special events. So for example, a farm with a limited amount of crop-based beverages wouldn't need multiple large-scale events. Therefore, local regs could limit the size and number of the events based upon the previous year's production. So you can at least go back and, you're not being arbitrary and capricious. You're going to go back and ask for what they did last year and make a reasonable decision based on that. So the first thing when you're reviewing this partnership with Ag and Markets to review the impact on the local community, number one, is this a farming operation or is it an event space? That's the first question. What is the true nature of this? Is the rental and the event incidental to the use of the farm operation? Next, is it in an agricultural district? So is it going to get that extra level of protection from New York Ag and Markets? Do you have zoning definitions? Is this permitted? Is this an activity that's already permitted, or are you going to have to issue a use variance? How about expedited review? If this is an activity that you want to see in your community, maybe you want to have an expedited review process so that you can speed things along, and that way somebody can have their event in June or July if you're only getting the application in May. And you can review it in terms of cost and time. Will this be a lengthy review period, or can you have a checklist and everything that's satisfied in the checklist then you can kind of sail through a little quicker? And on the other side, we have the municipal regulations. Are your regulations reasonable, or are they overly restrictive and onerous? Have you considered public health and safety? Are they threatened? Do you have, like I said, can people, is there proper egress? Can they get out in the event of an emergency? Will people be near farming equipment or the farm animals, attractive nuisances? What are those protections to keep people at bay from the farming operations? Do you need any amendments? And again, is there an expedited review an option? So do know that you can contact Ag and Markets. They have a good little publication on local laws in agricultural districts, and they can help to walk you through some of these issues. So next we have pet facilities. So pet facilities, I think, are very interesting. When does somebody become an animal, a cat lover versus a cat hoarder? What is that magic number between, I'm just going to take in this cat until it gets better, and next thing you know, now I'm a cat shelter. I'm not a hoarder, I'm a cat shelter. It all depends on your definitions at the local level. So we facilities and pet uses. Basically, they fall into the non-commercial or the commercial types. So, in the non-commercial types, we have adoption centers, pounds, shelters, private pet ownership. Companion animals or pets fall into the non-commercial pet ownership. We keep talking about the importance of definitions. When you are looking at your zoning definitions, hopefully you have identified a domestic pet versus an exotic pet versus a farm animal. I know I live in a village that does not allow farm animals to be held, to be in your house in the village. But remember that Vietnamese potbelly pig craze years ago, 20 years ago? They only stay little when you don't feed them. When you feed them, they get the size of a normal pig. Well, we had some of those, and there was, no, this is an exotic pet. This is, I'm allowed. It's my companion animal.
Yeah, then it becomes a therapy
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, oh, yes, Paula, thank you, that's where I was going with all of this. So it's important that you distinguish between the exotic pets, which can be, the reptiles of this world, and your domestic pets, what you want to consider a domestic pet, and then the farm animals.
Didn't you see there was maybe a couple of years ago, somebody was denied boarding on their plane in JFK because they couldn't bring their emotional support peacock with them. So I feel like we always see good news stories on what qualifies as a therapy animal.
Well, it's easy to
But can
get
you
that.
imagine if you're on a plane and it like,
Well, I don't even know how you would get that in a carrier under the seat. That's a long tail. But, all right, so in New York, many pet care facilities, including pet groomers and kennel operators, are not required to be licensed, nor are they subject to inspection. So companion animals or pets are defined and regulated differently than those defined as domesticated farm, livestock, wildlife, wild game, service, and working animals. So Paula brought up a good point. I guess one of the issues we have today is there is a difference between a proper service animal, like a guide dog, and for other reasons, and are they called emotional support animals? So, okay, so on the commercial side, these are subject to requirements like vaccinations and exams. So how do you regulate having these types of uses in your community? There's a demand for these uses, but they're not always a good fit for every location. So that's why maybe you'll be reviewing some use variances or area variances for these. But you can regulate the number of animals for sure. And this goes for backyard chickens. That was a craze a few years ago. You can regulate the gender, for example, of the chickens. So you could say we only want hens. We don't want any roosters. We don't want to hear that all night long or every morning. We don't want to hear it in the morning.
oh, they go all day.
Yeah. You can regulate minimum lot sizes and setbacks. That's a good thing to do. You can regulate parking requirements, the hours that the animals are allowed outside on their run. You can regulate for sound attenuation. So, for example, people think, well, we'll just put this kennel on the outskirts of town, no one will hear it. But when you're in a more rural community and there's not a lot of trees or buffering, the sound can certainly travel, and you can hear it way more than you would hear it in the city. And importantly, the emergency response plan. I know you've seen lots of videos from Katrina and other disasters where the floods were coming in and animals were stuck in cages in backyards. It's just a tragedy when that happens. So These facilities should have an emergency response plan so that if something happens, where these animals going to go, who's responsible for transporting them. And this is often overlooked in the review process. If you have a checklist for your site plan review or your permits, but certainly it's an important thing. You don't want to wait for a crisis to happen, so you say, oh, we should have thought of that, we should have addressed that, and we didn't. So if you have zoning, you can impose a special use permit. This means it's already an allowable use, but better fit or a perfect fit for that particular neighborhood. We can regulate it also with site plan review. Site plan review can be used with or without zoning. And the best thing about this is the ability to impose conditions on approval. So yes, you're imposing conditions to make sure it's a great fit, but what do these conditions do 10 years from now in the future? They ensure that your code enforcement officer has something in black and white in their hand to go to that property and say, look, you were supposed to have solid screening and landscaping so that we don't hear the barking or we don't smell this particular odor. If you don't have those conditions clearly written out and spelled out, then it's harder to enforce something, right? And it's harder to keep that property owner hold their feet to the fire, if you will. And the special use permit can be revoked with a public hearing if those conditions are no longer being held. So kennels are interesting because they are not defined, nor are they regulated by New York State Ag and Markets. Ag and Markets only protects livestock. They don't have anything to do with dogs and cats. Ag and Markets does regulate pet dealers. That means sellers and breeders. And they determine the threshold for retail and wholesale, and they do require dog licensing. So municipalities can restrict kennels and pet dealers, but they can't be so restrictive as to completely ban breeding. So this kind of protects the average person, not the average person, but the person that says, we're going to breed our golden retriever. We want her to have a couple litters and then we'll get her fixed, but we want the kids to see the life cycle or something like that. So you can't have laws that completely restrict a property owner's ability to do that. So your municipal regulations can't be less restrictive than the Ag and Markets law. And a word on specific dog breeds, your municipality can't outlaw a specific type of breed. So you can't say no pit bulls or no standard poodles or anything like that. I have seen places restricting animals based on weight, which is another way of doing things. Who's got a doggy daycare in their community? We have lots of them in the Capital District. I like to call it, you're in high cotton if you have a doggy day. If you can afford to pay to drop your dog off every day while you work at doggy daycare, then you're doing pretty well. So we're seeing a lot more of these. How would you regulate this? You can define the use. So you can say no more than X number of dogs allowed at the doggy daycare for the city of Albany, and clearly define no overnights. This is not a boarding operation. This is not a kennel. This is a drop-off, just like you would do with your kids. Drop them off, pick them up. They have a little fun. They have some naps. How do you regulate the potential impacts? So some of those impacts can be noise, as Paula said. You can regulate noise, measure it with decibels, and you can regulate parking. So maybe you don't need a big parking lot associated with these, because just like with a daycare, people aren't sticking around. You need a drop-off. You drop them off, they give them a kiss, and then they leave. So maybe you can regulate the spaces per dog based on staff requirements. And here's an example from the town of Amherst, outside of Buffalo. It defines doggy daycare as a commercial facility for supervised dog care, less than 24 hours a day. That's the key. Not including facilities that provide boarding, breeding, or selling of dogs, or facilities whose primary revenue is licensed veterinarian services. So a good zoning definition often will compare or contrast what the use is not. So then that solves a lot of gray area when people are coming to your municipality and they're like, oh, well, can I do this? No, it's right in our definition. It is not a boarding service or a kennel or anything like that.
I don't know, during COVID, I feel like weird businesses popped up, and at least in Albany, one of them is the groomer that comes to your driveway and washes your dog in your driveway now. Like, so even old, like, usually you would drop them off at the facility, now they come to you. I even had a guy come fix my bike that did the same. It's a mobile bike shop, shows up, fixes your stuff in your driveway, you know, you can keep working from home, it's awesome. So, seeing a lot more of these mobile type things. Also, there was this viral video of a doggy daycare where they pick them up with a bus. So they pull up to the house, the dog's super excited, the little door opens, and they hop on and get in their little seat, and then, you know, they go to the next house. Oh man, I watched too much videos on YouTube. So, telecommunications. And here, it's tough with telecommunications because really it's the federal government that kind of pre-opts your ability to really control a lot of this because the federal government really occupies the field here. So cell towers and cell service is considered a public utility, so they are afforded some relaxed protection from zoning. I think this was probably more of a more hot button issue probably in like the late 90s, early 2000s as we saw more cell service available to people back in the days of 2 and 3G. But now really we see the 5G is the 5th generation of cellular service is really where it's at. So, so they may be able to, you know, they can get a use variance if it's necessary to provide safe and adequate service. We have cases even here in New York of people passing, I think it was an elderly couple that passed away in the Adirondacks off the North Bay because they went off the road in a snowstorm and they weren't able to have cellular service to get themselves some emergency help. So, so there was there's, you know, a reason for more relaxed protection for offering these services. And if there's a significant gap in coverage, if it's placed on alternative sites. So a lot of times they're gonna come before you, and has anybody had a telecommunications application come before them? Okay, so a couple of you are probably pretty familiar with this. So they're gonna come to you and they're gonna tell you, we have, you know, drops in service in places. And so sometimes you can kind of figure out if that's necessarily true or not if you kind of drive around your municipality and take calls. So you just call each other using different services and see if the calls drop. Then maybe if they do, there might be a gap in service. And if you do have to give a use variance, make sure that you're giving, and really with any variances, you're offering the smallest one possible that achieves their goals and is also good for your community. So most of the cell, you know, the old cell towers, like the mega structures that we saw, really came out of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And this was where kind of they realized, I think the federal government and the FCC realized a lot of communities, there was a lot of pushback against having these in your community. So they decided, well, we'll just preempt here and really put kind of the kibosh on how much you can kind of resist these in your community. So, so a municipality cannot prohibit personal wireless service, and this is what we mostly got from it. So you can't say, no, we don't want this here, and let's face it, we're living in a more technical, you know, digital world. So, you know, people need this, and it's difficult even in more rural places where you might not actually have access to broadband. So we're seeing a lot of work happening on the state level in terms of rolling out more broadband in more rural places, especially after COVID. But here, this is, wireless can really start to help kind of fill in the gap in some places. The other protection, so that's the first one, is we can't prohibit personal wireless service altogether. So that one's easy. The second is we cannot be unreasonably, or we cannot unreasonably discriminate among the providers of essentially the same services. So we can't say, okay, we're going to cut a deal with Verizon because they're willing to pay more versus T-Mobile. So we can't do that. The third is you can't regulate on the basis of radio frequency emissions. So this is where we saw a lot of this the first time out, was people were really upset and not sure about radio frequency emissions and their issues on public health. Well, pretty much that has been taken away from municipalities, because I think a lot of us kind of used it as a kind of way to try to keep some of these places out from more extremely occupied, pretty densely populated places, because not necessarily everyone wants to live next to one of these. So now we can't look at the health effects of RF emissions. And then it kind of also was, they figured a lot of governments were kind of dragging their feet, of course, because they were not quite sure what it is, still trying to grapple with it. So now there are shot clocks in place. So a municipality has to act on applications within a reasonable period of time, and of course, they didn't leave it up to you to figure out what that was, but they were going to legislate it. So it's 90 days for co-locations for the big towers. So that's adding another service provider comes in and says, we want to add this kind of service, but we already have, there's already a tower here, we're just gonna, fix our equipment to it, and 150 days for new locations, so a new tower in itself. And it's important because these are, again, put in federal law, so we like to say keep checklists for those ones, because you need to know, when a provider comes to you, you want to make sure that you can figure out, do we have all the information we're going to need from them to make a determination first? And if not, we need to be really quick on letting them know what we need more from them, and then we don't want to run out of the time to review them. So Section 6409 of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, it's like government's favorite thing is mega omnibus bills that have everything under the sun and more. Well, they ended up putting in Section 6409, and that prohibits state and local governments from denying any eligible facilities requests for a modification on an existing wireless tower or base station that does not substantially change the physical dimensions of such tower or base station. And that means the eligible facilities include co-location, removal, or replacement of transmission equipment. So what we saw kind of providers get kind of foxy about is substantial is usually one of those terms that is terms of art that are hard to define, because substantial to one person might not be substantial to another. But here they defined it as 10% in height. So what you normally see is these applications that come before you, and the tower is really tall, but they're going to attach all their equipment halfway up. But what they were doing essentially is, because of this section, if you have that, they can essentially go back and then add more to it without having to come before you at all. So we saw a lot of places where they would ask for these really large towers that didn't really make sense for the amount of service that they were providing. And it was because it's easier for them after the fact that they can just go back and attach more to it without really having to go to the municipality at all. So in that case, it's always helpful kind of, having that conversation about why they needed a certain height, what are they actually going to do, what's it going to actually look like once they start affixing transmission equipment to it. So make sure that you ask those questions. And then the distributed antenna systems really brought a whole kind of new area to this with the advent of what we call 5G, the 5th generation wireless technology. And here is, we kind of have to have it, because eventually what happens is we have so many mobile devices that we've completely almost built out our 4G or 4th generation network. So we had to figure out a new place to find a new band of service to provide more, for more devices, like what people call the Internet of Things. So all these, you know, now you can get like a fancy refrigerator that's connected to the internet and tell you what you need at the store. It's stuff like that that we require more wireless technology. So for, again, you know, municipalities didn't really know how to respond to these because these are much smaller and can kind of be put anywhere along the landscape. So, so at that point, this, you know, the FCC stepped in again in September 2018 and had a declaratory ruling to really remove any barriers that inhibits the deployment of the 5G network. So we tend to see these more, I think, in at least the first rollout is in more, you know, densely populated places because the wavelengths only travel as far, they don't travel as far as like the older networks, the 3Gs and the 4Gs. So in this point, it's kind of the FCC kind of made it so that it's a little bit easier for the providers to deploy these out in our communities. So we got another shot clock again. So for these instead, these smaller ones that typically we see on like light posts, traffic signals, they tend to be put in a lot of the right-of-ways. So for co-location on pre-existing structures like light poles, utility poles, all of these places, it's 60 days, which is pretty short in review. Or for new locations, it's 90 days. And delays of that could be argued as effective prohibition of service, going back to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. But the issue there is it's tough to sue people in federal court because our federal court system works pretty slowly. So usually I think the providers are a little bit more flexible with the shot clocks themselves in real life. And the shot clocks are the same for either one small antenna or 20. So if you have somebody that's coming in and deploying a lot of these, it's sometimes helpful to get some like help from a consultant from the outside who can really tell you what to look for and what you're going to need to know. And the shot clock commencement can't be delayed by a pre-application meeting. So again, it's really important to have somebody local or at least able that you can kind of touch base with to help you through this process, because I think a lot of communities don't necessarily see these often, so they can be, you know, pretty intimidating when they show up with, you know, a team of attorneys and, you know, engineers and whatnot. And it applies to all permits required for deployment, which also includes any of your local issues that you might have, because these are put on maybe on light signals in some communities. Like that includes all municipal review. So if it has to go through multiple departments, like, you know, maybe you have somebody take a look at it in different offices, the shot clocks include that time. So always important to kind of keep these in mind when they come through. So what happens if an application is deemed incomplete? And so local governments here can reset or pause the shot clock once they figure out that the application is incomplete. So within 10 days, you have to make that determination and then notify the provider or the applicant of those deficiencies. And then once you get a complete application back, you would start the shot clock again. But your incomplete determination has to be made by the 30th day after an application is filed, and within 10 days after resubmission if you've already told them they're lacking issues. So this one, it's like hard, so this is one to have kind of those checklists and timelines with you, because it's hard to keep track of these, especially if you don't have maybe full-time staff working in your municipality. What kind of fees can you charge? And the FCC even ruled on that one. So there are safe harbor fees. So for them, that's $500 per application for 5 small cells and $100 after each additional one. And a $270 annual fee per small cell facility that covers all of the issues of your right-of-ways and attachments and any other reoccurring fees. And a 1,000 pole. So if they just put it on its own individual pole, you can charge up to $1,000. Of course, you can charge more than that, but again, the carrier would have to take you to federal court for that. A lot of them don't necessarily want to do that because it's a really long, drawn-out process for everybody. But if you do go above that, basically the local government has the burden of demonstrating why those amounts are reasonable. And really reasonable means related to the administrative functions and review that are happening at the municipal level. But they might be willing to pay a little bit more because they really want it in your community. So, of course, then the next one that we always get a lot of questions about is the aesthetic concerns. And you can certainly have those, but hopefully you have them for every other structure in your community that has to go through this. So we like to say, if you're a community with design guidelines, that's great. And you have a certain feel about what your downtown, light fixtures look like, that's perfectly fine, so long as it's, across the board for everyone. So we have some of that out of places like Denver and Montgomery County, Maryland, when this was really first put out. Cambridge, Massachusetts is another place because of MIT. They were kind of above grade. But sometimes here, as you can see, it doesn't look, too out of place because the antenna's at the top, so it doesn't look too crazy. And a lot of times at this point, you're starting to see them in places that you kind of don't expect. We were driving along the thruway today, there was one on top of a silo. So it's an interesting, we were like, oh look, there's more 5G right there. So I think providers are figuring out more creative places to put these that they're a little bit more out of, not necessarily a problem on your main streets. So right-of-way concerns. If you are going to have these here, you should have standards for wireless installations on things like your traffic lights and street lighting and utility poles, and then especially make sure that you have rules for turning off those facilities if somebody has to climb up there and work on them, because you don't want them to be, overly expose someone to radio frequency waves. And so really to wrap this one up, the FCC rule basically also took away a municipality's ability to adopt a moratorium, so don't do that. They come before you. You can't deny applications like the old school big towers, the little ones on the environmental or health effects of radio frequency waves. And you can't impose spacing requirements because sometimes there's so many of these in your downtown, you might not want to see them on every single block. But to do so there could be an argument of effective prohibition, so really try not to do that. You can certainly ask them why they need to put it in the certain places, and they should be able to explain to you why they want to put these on certain places in your community. So never feel afraid to ask questions of an applicant that comes before you. Then, of course, be sure that your instructions and application materials are clear to wireless and really all the these applicants that are coming before you, what to kind of expect. Quickly determine if your application is complete. So again, sometimes you don't see these that often, that you might hire an outside consultant that will actually bring you through this operation, because they do this with so many other local governments across New York State. And if you do decide to exceed exceed the safe levels in fees, just make sure that you can kind of reflect it in your higher administration and permitting costs if you are challenged in court. But I'm gonna take a guess and say hopefully you won't be challenged in federal court. Okay. Now Trish's gonna talk about the other big one that you probably will say you see in your community, solar and wind.
Paul brought up a great point. For many of these controversial, bigger cases, you know, the applicant's attorneys will show up in suits and ties, and they can be really intimidating. You know, they can barrel through and, you know, do it like this, we do this all the time, we know, and, you know, they can be almost pushy. And listen, the ball is in your court. They want to site their facility in your yard, in your home, and you really have the responsibility to take a breath and say, hold on, we have questions, or hold on. If you have a local law or it's part of your municipal budget, you can have your own professional review services built into these applications. That means you're not stuck necessarily with your own municipal attorney. This goes for zoning boards too, and planning boards. You can hire your own expert, one that you feel comfortable with, to represent you or to go over questions that you might have. Or maybe you want to hire your own landscape architect or engineer, or someone to break it down in layman's terms what this really means and what your rights are and the questions you should be asking. So it's really worse to sit back and not ask questions and maybe feel intimidated than it is to say, hold on, I don't understand this, we need clarification. You can contact us at the Department of State. You can contact your county planning office with questions. These are resources with professional planners on staff, people that do this stuff day in and day out. And they're here to help you so that you don't have to go it alone and feel like you're all alone in reviewing these applications. We really do want to help you and answer your questions as much as possible. Because, you know, most of you are lay people. Most of you are not attorneys that deal with 5G on a daily basis, right? Or we're coming up now with solar and wind. So these are renewable energies that have been with us for a while, but they are really heating up. When I first started with the Department of State, my background was in wind turbine regulation. And that's pretty much what I did day in and day out. And then it seemed to take a back seat while solar exploded. Like solar seems to be like the main controversial issue in communities with a lot of large flat land that is ripe for solar development. So no matter where you stand on this issue, whether you're pro or against, we can go over how to help you regulate this use or not have this use in certain cases in your community. So how did we get to this situation where we're at right now? We have the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA. Maybe you've heard this acronym bandied about. The whole goal of this act is, well, let me back up. When I was first doing wind turbines, as I told you, most of those, all of those could be regulated at the local level. Municipalities had home rule authority to decide, we want this, we don't want it, or we want it and this is exactly where we want it. You had the power to decide those things. In doing so, applications were being dragged out and slowed down because they were so controversial. Maybe not in my term of office, or something, you know, maybe kicking the can down for the next planning board member, or ZBA member, or next supervisor or mayor. And you know, we are in a crisis, an energy crisis again, so we need more forms of energy. So we have the CLCPA, and the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's an ambitious goal. Reduce them by 40% by the year 2030. And we aim to have zero emissions from electricity from 2040. Yes?
You know, we have the Partnership and Community Protection Act. However, we had Governor Cuomo appoint, I think it was 21, it may have been 22, political hacks that didn't know their solar energy from their posterior. 19,
We call them appointees.
well, no, there were things in the
Just
posterior. But
appointees.
anyway, when the final vote came, the vote was, I think, 18 to 3 pro, okay? But if you read what the 3 people who voted against it, one of them, which is the state, oh, I can't, what is this? The state controller of energy, I guess, that's not his, what his name is, Gavin Donovan, know him well from my past experiences, voted against this. But if you look at this, it's not going to get us to where we want to go, because the people that were in it, in my opinion, really didn't know what they were talking about. So we can go on.
Okay, thank you. Well, and we might touch on some of those ambitious goals. So we want to increase renewable sources. So that's everything. That's geothermal, that's wind, that's solar, because we know we can't get to these goals by any one of these things. I mean, even if we considered all of them, it's still going to be a push. But I gotta say, if you don't have a goal, you're just spinning your wheels and you're never gonna, you know, you're gonna, you need a bullseye. If you're playing darts, you gotta aim at something to hit it. So at least we do have these goals to check in on us. So we have the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act passed by the Cuomo administration in 2020. So their goal was to achieve those targets in a timely manner. So as I said before, when it came to wind, a lot of those applications were just stuck in the pipeline. They weren't going anywhere. And you know, were we losing? Were we, you know, who was benefiting? Who was losing by all of these things just stuck in a pipeline while New York continues to need energy and be dependent on foreign energy sources. So the other goal was to construct and create more renewable energy systems. In doing so, Cuomo created this new office, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, ORIS. The key word here is siting. So now ORIS is going to decide where these large-scale renewable energy facilities will be sited. It's no longer within the power of the local municipality to make some of those decisions. So that being said, that's the background. So what is the ORIS responsibilities? We don't have to read all of these, but essentially ORIS supplants the local review process and the seeker, the environmental review that used to be done. Now ORIS is the one-stop shop for deciding where and when these facilities of a certain size will be sited. So no more blocks in the pipeline or anything. That's the idea. So they've developed a uniform standard to be used for siting, designing, and engineering. They implement Executive Law 94C. So this is the word that you will hear bandied about. 94C, 94C. Essentially, 94C means that ORIS is taking over the siting and this review process. So new applications under 94C should be completed within 1 year of the application being deemed complete. So once everything is in and they have enough information to establish their review, the timeline starts and they have 1 year. So compare that to, you know, Article 10 and the other process at the local level, which could have taken years. So wind is in here also, just to backtrack a little bit. because your local regulations should distinguish between agricultural, residential, and commercial wind turbines. You can't have one reference to wind and hope that it fits every use. It doesn't, because they're all very different. So agricultural wind turbines refer to what the farmer would use to power his farming operations. It does not refer to a commercial wind turbine on the farm whose sole purpose is to sell energy back to the grid. That's the difference. That's the distinction. So you can regulate wind turbines. If you have zoning, you can restrict these to certain districts in your municipality, or you can say, we don't want them at all in our municipality. You can regulate the setbacks. You can regulate for sound, and here's where you'd want to probably would want to enlist an acoustical engineer, so you can measure the decibels and, these. Does anybody live near one of these? Have a turbine? No? Okay. Anyone been close enough to one to hear the sound? Okay, so they do make a sound, right? They do, but they make a sound when the wind is blowing. They don't make a sound when they're not moving. And that's another thing with the wind turbines. No wind, they're not blowing. And same thing with solar. No sun, they're not producing energy. So we can't rely on any one of these sources to achieve the goals of the CLCPA. Sorry about that. And there we have that special use permit. Again, the special use permit means you have zoning. This is an allowable use subject to standards. And the thing with a special use permit is if the applicant meets all of those standards, you can't deny the permit. If you've asked them to jump through all those hoops and do everything and they've done it, then they've fulfilled their obligation and you can't deny the permit. And if you don't have zoning, you can regulate these through site plan review. But be very careful not to use the word setbacks, because anytime you start working with dimensional requirements, that is a form of backdoor zoning. So communities that do this can get away with it because they have some type of relief board. If you have zoning, you have the ZBA. If you don't have zoning and you're regulating with site plan review, an applicant probably has some relief board. Maybe it's the town board that they go to when those provisions are too onerous and they need some relief. All right, so these are the new terms that NYSERDA has come up with. So maybe your current regulations refer to rooftop solar or ground-mounted solar. I think it's best practice if you get on board with this terminology as early as possible, because this is how we're referring to things. Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Tier 1 is a roof-mounted or a building-integrated solar energy system. So roof-mounted, maybe a residential unit or maybe a store, like a grocery store that has these on the roof. Building-integrated means it could be a panel. It could look like a wall like this, and it's just integrated right into the surface of the building. And it's not angled out or anything like that, like it would be on the roof. So Tier 2 is a ground-mounted system that generates up to 110% of the energy consumed on the site over the last 12 months. So that's an important distinction, because you could have a ground-mounted system that produces more than 110%. If it does produce more than that 110% of what's used on site, now you've tripped up to the next level. Now you're in Tier 3, where solar is the primary use. This is the commercial solar application. So it's not just somebody having it on their rooftop, or it's not that office building or the store with it on their property. Their sole purpose of Tier 3 is to sell energy back to the grid. So this is important to know. Projects that are generating less than 20 megawatts can be reviewed at the local local level. That's you guys. You have to find out what the total megawatts are going to be generated for this project. If it's more than 25 megawatts, guess what? You're not going to be reviewing it. It's going to go into ORA's domain. More than 25 megawatts, ORA's takes over the siting. That's it in a nutshell.
What happens to that other 5,000 megawatts in between?
Yeah,
Oh,
it's kind of weird,
that's
20 to
interesting.
25.
Oh, we'll get up to, we'll cover that. I just gave you that in a nutshell, but
Okay.
I like that you're paying attention back there in the back seat. Okay. We have some options, and we'll get to that. All right. So, solar in neighborhoods. How many of you have solar? Are you reviewing approved or something like this? Okay, so you can fully regulate these. We suggest that you avoid putting these in the front yard installations because you want to minimize visibility from the road. Avoid the permanent loss of character-defining features of historic buildings. Does solar have a place in historic buildings? Yes, and some people say no, some people say yes. It depends on how delicately and thoughtfully you put the arrays. So let's face it, you have to put the arrays where they're going to get the most sun. So you are limited in where it's going to make the most sense and where you can put them. We do have a publication, let's see, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has designed guidelines for solar installation. So it's a really good handbook for working in historic districts with historic buildings. You don't want to, with anything with historic changes, you don't want to make any changes that can't be undone in the future. Because our technologies, our materials are always changing, hopefully improving, and maybe you need to undo something and install something better. So you don't want to permanently screw something up that can't be undone. And locate them on non-historic buildings or the additions. So this is the biggie, Tier 3, solar as the primary use. This tends to be the one that's the most controversial. There's winners and losers. Some people are going to be making a lot of money on this, and some people, maybe if you live across the street from one, or your view shed is interrupted, then you may be the loser. Or the character of your entire community could change. Maybe you're no longer an agricultural community, and all of the spin-off operations that come with farming, the feed store, the vet. I don't know, they say farmers spend, more than 89% of their income goes back to the local economy. So it makes you wonder what happens to this when farming changes. And just like with wind turbines as well, it's only the landowner that's collecting the royalties and making the money, right? Oftentimes farms will rent out their parcels to other farmers to rent. And when this happens, now they're out of a job, they're out of a livelihood, they have to think of something else to do or leave the community. So you can regulate these with the special use permit, the site plan review. You can relegate them to industrial and agricultural zones. You can also regulate for adverse impacts, adverse environmental impacts. The environment is defined extremely broadly. It's not just flora and fauna, it's also the economic health of your community, your main streets. It's your view sheds, your cultural view sheds. It's all kinds of things. So when you're doing reviews and you're considering the environment, think big. Think everything that's going to be impacted in your community is considered the environment. So you can regulate lot sizes, screening, battery storage. This is the next big thing that, we were so fast to get on board with solar laws that now we're catching up with battery storage and safety. Did anyone see the YouTube video of the was it Shazy or Shimo? Shimo, yes. Yes, where it caught fire, I saw that one.
Town
And
of Lyme.
on the what?
Town of Lyme.
Town of Lyme, yes, and it was like right in the village,
Just
so,
outside, yes.
yeah, and so that's, nobody saw that one coming, right? The stay
Well.
inside, the smoke is bad. And finally, the big one is decommissioning. What do we do when these things, this goes for wind turbines as well, when they've run their natural course, maybe 20 years, they need to be upgraded, removed. Decommissioning, what happens when the company maybe financially fails and leaves town, or we do a whole 2-hour show on solar, so we're only just scratching the surface here. But when it comes to solar, these tier 3s in agricultural areas in particular, you really want to do your best to prohibit or to avoid installing them on farmlands, prime or unique soils, or soils of statewide or local importance, right? There is a place for solar in agricultural areas, but it's not on the #1 best soils that you have. They don't exist everywhere. They're the jewel in the crown. Why would you waste those? You need to preserve them for food. So put these panels on the perimeter or on fallow land or marginal lands that aren't the primes. Avoid wetlands, floodplains, and under most circumstances, because we do see solar panels in wetlands now. When they use like a corkscrew kind of thing, and it's deemed not to be environmentally invasive. So look for more of those, and certainly avoid critical environmental areas for obvious reasons. And New York Department of Ag and Markets has publication guidelines for agricultural mitigation for solar energy projects. That's another good one. NYSERDA has the solar energy toolkit with model laws. They also have the battery storage covered in their handbooks and model laws as well. So this is the important slide that we're going to go into a little more depth on. Who reviews the projects? So if these projects are relatively small, they're under 20 megawatts, you get to do it using your home rule authority. Nothing's changed. You can regulate these as you see fit. If your project falls in that middle zone, if it's between 20 to 24.9 megawatts, you can have local review or you can opt into 94C. What's 94C? ORAS. You can, yes?
Who decides that?
Or,
No.
No.
Who decides if you can opt in?
Yeah.
The municipality. You decide. Yep, you decide. So if you have new projects that are 25 megawatts or more, new projects, they're automatically going to the 94C. If you have a project that's currently under Article 10, then you can stay in Article 10 or you can proceed to 94C. So here's a tip that I hope to share with you. I hope that you all have a current comprehensive plan where you've identified your goals, especially when it comes to renewable energies like wind or solar or who knows what's coming next. Do we want this use or do we not want this use? And if we want this use, where exactly do we want it? And if we don't want this use, why? Maybe we don't want this use because we have an historic viewshed or an important cultural area viewshed, or we prize the right to farm or our farming community. On the other hand, you could say we want to embrace renewables. We are a community looking to, do our part to create more energy in a sustainable way. It could go either way, but it's your decision how you want to write your goals. I think it's important that you have goals established because when ORAS comes in to do the siting, they will look to your local regulations. And if you don't have any local regulations, what are they going to use? But if you have something, some mean they have to abide by them, but they have to consider the desires of the local community and your local regulations. So that is my tip. I hope that you have either one way or the other, no matter where you stand on this. I hope that you have something in your comp plan, in your local regulations that establish where you are on this important topic, so that when a state agency or even a federal agency comes in, they look to the will of the people, the goals of the people when making their determination. So all is not lost. So, yeah.
But under 94C, they look at that, yes, but they do not have to abide by it.
Yes, I said that.
94C says, we don't need any input from the locals. And that's exactly what 94C is. Back in the old Article 10 days, well, in my old Article 10 days, you know, there's always local input into the process.
Well,
I think that's the most frustrating thing.
there still is a built into that process. There still is a part for community participation, public education. It's built into that. But I mean, what more can I say about the importance of deciding for yourself what your community wants and where it wants? So it's important that you not wait on these things and, you know, have something identified. Okay, and finally,
I see you haven't covered anything about road use maintenance. I think that's an awful important thing for local municipalities to have something with these local developers and county also.
Okay, let's get to, let me just finish this slide, and then I'll do yours. We have a ton of locally unwanted land uses, so I'm glad that you brought that one up. And it has to do with renewable energies, because built into these reviews of your special use permit, you can consider heavy haul routes and the construction phase as well, because you're going to have a lot of heavy commercial construction vehicles coming in and compacting soil and possibly changing stormwater runoff paths. And so you can have these built into the review to restore the roads or to have them improved with culverts or what have you, but that can be built into the review process as well. And Cornell has a wonderful publication called the Cornell Local Roads Program. So they can be a great resource for you, not only on renewable energy projects, but just general roads that are not traveled as much and seasonal road uses. I think Tuck Hill put out a publication on seasonal road. We can make that available to you because that's a really great publication that they did a great job working on, really helpful. Did you have a specific question about roads, or did I cover it?
That's fine.
Okay. All right, so yeah?
Sorry, can we just clarify the roads impacted by this heavy construction for the solar fund?
Mm-hmm.
A town could insist on additional fees from the company to repair that?
I don't think they call it additional fees, but they write it in to say restore or repair the roads.
Maintenance agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called a road maintenance agreement.
Right, there has to be a bond, should be a bond attached to the road maintenance agreement.
But with bonds, remember, you can only hold them for 3 years.
Yeah, bonds are tricky.
But if we have a residential development,
Okay.
and they're gonna be dragging in all of the housing on the back of trucks and assembling the houses on site off a country road that's 17 feet wide. And so we'll get destroyed in the midst of all of this. It would be feasible to have one of these road maintenance contracts.
I think so. And it's important that you bring up something good about residential development. The municipality, usually at the end of a residential development, the developer wants to turn those roads back over to the municipality. Like, it's your problem now. The municipality does not have to accept the roads.
Well, the municipality I mean, there's just one road into where the development's going to be at the end of the road.
Okay.
And it's already a public road. They're not building a new road or anything like that. They're going to be using the existing 17-foot wide public highway.
Okay, let me right back, let's talk about this and stay in touch after this, and we can give you some better resources and a more solid answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I remember something happened on, is it the Cayuga Lake? That's another thing, like every time the thruway tolls go up, the truckers look for alternate routes, right, to save money. And these things really impact the local roads. They were never built for the volume or the weight. But you have to be really careful when you're drafting maintenance regulations that you're not hurting the local farmer who's, with the dairy trucks and his regular farm equipment, because you don't want to inadvertently do anything that would, hurt them when you're trying to help everybody else.
We don't have that issue on this road, so.
Oh, okay.
The farms died out a long time ago.
Okay, well, not every place is a good source for solar or wind. Even though you have wind and you have sunshine, you may lack the hosting capacity. So not every location is feasible. The number one thing is access to transmission lines is critical. They need that tie-in. Is it like $3 million a mile to, is it 1 to 3 million?
No, I think it's 1 million a mile.
1 million? Okay, all right, wasn't sure. It's really expensive to get close to those interconnections. For obvious reasons, avoid developing on steep slopes and sensitive areas, and wherever those transmission lines are close to prime farmland, mitigation. What can you do to offset that? If there's no other way that they can't avoid putting those transmission lines on prime farmland. And now Paul is going to talk about cannabis. And
We're almost out of time.
we're almost out of time, so can we stay and do the cannabis? Yeah?
How many of you think that this is a serious issue in your community anyway? So the issue with cannabis right now is it's so slow to roll out, mostly because the state is really slow in getting their framework together because they keep being sued over it. So just quickly is the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act, what we call MRTA. Adult use over 21 years of age, you can purchase up to 3 ounces of flower, 24 grams of concentrated cannabis. You're allowed to smoke wherever tobacco smoke is allowed, though a lot of municipalities don't allow it in the open in their municipality. They don't want smoking in parks and whatnot, and that's totally fine. Consumption's not allowed on federal lands, it's still a Schedule I drug. Workplaces, in your car, law enforcement can search your car if they smell burnt cannabis, but otherwise they're not really supposed to stop you anymore. We have dispensaries and adult use consumption sites. We haven't seen the regs on the adult on-site consumption, so I don't think even one license has gone out on that one. So, and I think that's kind of focused more on downstate and New York City. We do have cannabis delivery licenses that are currently active, and there are some dispensaries across the state. And it's basically licensed all through the Office of Cannabis Management. They have a cannabis control board. It took a really long time for them to staff that, which is why part of the reason between that and they don't have a lot of staff as to why we haven't seen a whole lot of regulations really out the door.
They have a goal of 50% of licenses to social equity applicants. That's actually the current subject of current litigation. So they've put a pause on adding any additional licensing out there. In the future, we will have home grow allowed, 3 mature and 3 immature plants, so 12 plants per household. Who knows when we'll actually see those regulations roll out. The taxing overall is 13%, 9% to the state, 4% to the municipality. It goes 75% to the local municipality that's hosting the dispensary, 25% to the county. And then there's an excise tax based on how strong the, the products that you're buying. Industry. I'm not sure if that's actually going to be true in the end because we have been so slow to roll this out. But on the local side, you had till the end of the year of 2021 to opt out. So you might be a community that's already made their decision by opting out. You can always opt back in, but if you opted out, you're out of the tax revenue. So I think a lot of communities decided to maybe opt back in the future. You definitely have reasonable control over your local zoning. Remember, it's where they are, define them. Distancing is probably okay. I think the original is 1,000 feet between them and a religious facility and 500 feet between each facility. But again, a lot of them, if we look to Massachusetts, who has a much more robust industry, they are uses of, if you have downtown areas that are struggling in terms of like an old Friendlies that has become a dispensary, you can put them in places. In fact, I think the one on the bottom is from Massachusetts and a former Friendlies. So it could be an interesting way of driving traffic kind of into some of your downtowns, especially if you realize that you have some of these older buildings that are kind of sitting vacant right now. Just on the public health, it's funny, we haven't really heard a whole lot on this one, but they do have laboratory good testing, and basically, I think the issue they're having the most right now is the illegal, prominence of the regulations being so slow that a lot of people are illegally selling this from other states. So it's, the labeling is up to wherever it comes from. So in the future though, if you actually go to a New York State licensed dispensary, they should be able to tell you what's in it. And of course there's public education campaigns being around this, especially about trying to keep this out of the hands of children. And money will go into different funding there. Comprehensive data monitoring in cannabis use and other health and safety outcomes. Basically, it's one of those ones that you would think we'd have more in details of messaging to give you, but it's just been pretty slow. And then finally, just defending your decision. So the record, make sure it tells the story of the application. So it should have your application, your newspaper notices, meeting minutes, any of your seeker materials, public hearing testimony, written submissions from the public, and expert opinions. And then make sure that you're writing good decisions, conditions, and findings, because if you're challenged, that's what the court's going to go back and take a look at. So if you're on a ZBA, explain why the person does or does not meet each prong of the use and area variance test. The findings describes the reason for denial or approval, so don't just say oh, the applicant didn't achieve this. You want to say why they did it. It should support why you have conditions. Make those conditions really easy for your enforcement official to go out and take a look and be able to actively enforce. Don't use conclusionary statements like the standards weren't met. The more you put into your findings, the more you'll stand a chance in court if you are challenged. Because they're not going to redo your tests, especially if you're on a ZBA, but they are going to look to make sure that you actually did take into account all the tests that you should be covering. So the more dedication and the more time you put into your findings, the better for everybody. And finally, the most important questions. No question is too minor. This is literally what we do. We are probably one of the last places in New York State government that truly is there for local government, so feel free to reach out to us at any time. We like weird questions, we like tricky situations, and always thanks for staying a little bit late. Thank you for your service to your communities. This is a hard job. We know it's a hard job. We appreciate you guys coming out for training, and keep in touch.
Thank you.